Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Wednesday, the 26th of November, 2025, one day before Thanksgiving. Yesterday, we had a great conversation with the London-based football journalist, Amy Lawrence, one of the contributors to the Soccer 100, about the greatest footballers in history. I asked her about Maradona versus Pele versus Messi. She is a contributor to the Soccer 100, and she, interestingly enough, while the crowd, the mob, voted for Messi, she believes that Pele was the greatest player in history. We have another contributor to the Soccer 100 on the show today, Michael Cox, another London-based football journalist, another guy who works for The Athletic. He, in the Soccer 100, wrote a wonderful essay about Diego Maradona. So, Michael, to begin, did you vote for Maradona as the greatest player in history?
I didn't actually. Funnily enough, I think I probably had him slightly lower than most people. But he's maybe the most interesting one to write about, I think. And so for that article, I focused just on that game, the World Cup quarter-final against England in 1986, where he scores maybe the greatest goal of all time, 5 minutes after scoring probably the most controversial goal of all time. And one of the interesting things about that is the jersey that he wore for that game is the most expensive sports jersey ever bought at auction. So that was quite a nice little tale.
Yeah, and you note at the end that the English defender, Terry Fenwick, I think at one point he played for Spurs, but I don't know whether he was playing for QPR or Spurs at the time. But he kicked him off the pitch, and then at the end, he made the ultimate mistake of not swapping his shirt with Maradona. So he would have had the opportunity to acquire the most expensive shirt in football history, but as a rather dim-witted English defender, he chose not to.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably cost him about several times his complete career earnings.
Put it mildly, and I don't think we'll find Terry Fenwick in the Soccer 100. So you don't remember who you voted for? You're not willing to publicly go for one of these? Is it Messi, Pele, or Maradona, or do you think there's a fourth man here who really should be the greatest player in history, viewed at least?
No, I went for Messi. I think the longevity of his club career, combined with the fact that he won, obviously, the World Cup last time out, at the fifth time of asking, I think he's ticked every box. I think there's a few contenders for it. I think there's a debate about how much emphasis you place on club football and international football. I think that's probably shifted over the years. I think back in the day, the World Cup was clearly the best, most important tournament. I think these days, maybe people look to the Champions League first and foremost, and the World Cup's almost a bit of a bonus. But it's tough to compare eras, of course. But I think Messi has, there's just no questions you can really ask of Messi anymore. I think he's done everything, and he's done it over such a consistent period of time.
Well, the one thing, though, wouldn't it be fair to say that Messi is lacking is he's a rather bland character. He's not a very interesting man, whereas, for better or worse, Maradona is a remarkable character. I don't know if you've seen the Capadia movie about Maradona. I mean, there are remarkable chapters in his career in Barcelona and Naples, let alone all the World Cup stuff. So does Messi reflect the blandness of contemporary football, Michael?
Maybe. I agree he's not as much of a character as Maradona. To be fair, I think there's a few others on that list, at the top of the list, you could say maybe weren't the most fascinating characters. But I do understand what you mean. And the tough thing, of course, is Messi was always compared to Maradona. I mean, from when he was 16, 17 years old, he was never going to have that connection with Argentina because obviously he left Argentina at the age of 13, moved to Barcelona. He certainly had to do a lot to win over the Argentine public. I don't think he will ever be held in quite as high esteem as Maradona, but obviously in leading him to the World Cup in 2022, I think he's, without question, a national hero, but certainly doesn't have the character of Maradona. I mean, the thing about Maradona was that he was almost every season in his career was eventful in one way or the other. And I think in a way, his character, if you look at the highlights of his career, it's about his character, and he had fantastic highlights. He also had some very low points in his career. I know people who watched him regularly in the 1980s who say that week in, week out, for his club teams, he didn't produce on the way that he did at World Cups with Argentina. Messi, I don't think you would say the same. I think he was obviously very consistent for Barcelona. So yeah, he was maybe more bland than Maradona, but I think also more consistent in his performances.
And what about Pele? Amy thought he is the king. I mean, remarkable career in the World Cup. I mentioned to Amy yesterday when we talked that my father loved Pele more than anything else because he saw him on TV, and you couldn't watch many people on TV those days. But Pele spent his entire domestic career playing for a Brazilian club, Santos. Is that an important thing to bear in mind in terms of who you play for? Of course, Messi is best known for his career at Barcelona. Maradona played for Napoli, began his career at Barcelona. Does it matter that Pele didn't have an international career in club football?
I don't think so, because I don't think it matters as much at that time for a few reasons. I mean, one, obviously Brazil at this point are the dominant nation in world football, summed up by the fact he's the only person to win 3 World Cups. And the domestic football at that time was extremely strong. And when you look at the competitive games between the South American teams and the European teams at that time, the club sides from South America were very strong. And I don't think, there wasn't the financial or kind of competitive prestige need to play your football in Europe in the 1960s, 1970s, as there would be today. And I think you also have to remember, Brazil, obviously, an incredibly football-loving country, and one with a population of, a few European countries combined. So actually the competitiveness and the strength of the Brazilian domestic league at that point, I don't think is inferior to what you would have found in any European country. So no, through a modern lens, it obviously would feel very strange if a great Brazilian didn't leave Brazil probably by the age of 22, 23 to play in Europe. But no, in the 1960s, I think that was perfectly acceptable. And there was actually a period where he was basically forbidden from leaving by the Brazilian authorities because he was considered such a, almost a natural resource they were proud of. And as with many players of that time, they were effectively barred from going abroad. You could say the same about Ferenc Puskás in Hungary for a little while. So no, back in those days, there were much strict laws about foreign players as well. So you didn't have as many foreigners going abroad or as many players going abroad. So no, I don't think it's too much of a factor in his career.
And then the reverse of Pele, of course, was so famous for his exploits, achievements at the World Cup, 1958, 1962, 1970, is another character that you feature in the book. You write an excellent essay on the Real Madrid forward Alfredo Di Stefano, who was born in Argentina, ended up playing his national career for Spain without a great deal of success. Is Di Stefano the reverse narrative of Pele?
Yeah, it's a really nice way to put it. Never played at the World Cup. I think unquestionably the best player never to have played at the World Cup, despite the fact he represented Argentina and Spain and Colombia, albeit in games that are kind of unofficial and not officially recognised by FIFA. And yeah, his success really was all about the European Cup. And I think Di Stefano, you can make an argument that he was maybe the most influential club player ever. I think he did a great deal to popularise the European Cup.
Yeah, he scored in 5 consecutive European Cup finals, which is an astonishing. That's an astonishing achievement.
Yeah, and when the European Cup was formed, it was a bit of a controversial idea. There were some people who didn't think it was really worthwhile playing, international club competition in the way the European Cup basically proposed. And Di Stefano and that Real Madrid team were one of the forerunners, really, and he was one of the people who made it into such a special competition. And there was also a great story about how the fact, he could have gone to Barcelona. He was quite close to signing for Barcelona.
Well, didn't he when he originally came from Argentina, didn't he go to Barcelona and then he was essentially stolen by Madrid through Franco? There was a political dimension to it all.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, there's so many stories like this in football, isn't there? The same with Eusebio, I think, could have gone to Sporting Lisbon. But I mean, at that point, Real Madrid's main rivals were really considered Atletico Madrid. Obviously, they're city rivals. Barcelona were a factor, but they weren't the 1 and 2 in Spain as they would come to be known. And the fact that, you know, the greatest player of his era, or probably certainly the greatest club player of his era, was stolen away from Barcelona was part of the reason that Real Madrid-Barcelona became probably the biggest rivalry in European football.
Well, wasn't there I don't know that much about this, but wasn't there probably we get Sid Lowe on the show to ask this question, wasn't there a political rivalry between Madrid and Catalonia, which might have, and given how unpopular Franco was in Catalonia, that might have compounded all this?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, obviously that goes back to a few years before this period, but certainly in terms of the footballing rivalry, I think this was the time when it became Real Madrid against Barcelona as the rivalry, rather than, I mean, when you look at the first half of the 20th century, the successful Spanish clubs are Real Madrid and Atletico Madrid and Athletic Bilbao, and Barcelona come on the scene, okay, relatively early in terms of being formed, but in terms of being the dominant club or one of the dominant clubs in Spain, it's a little bit later. So yeah, there's certain points where that rivalry really takes off, but I think the Di Stefano saga is certainly one of them.
And then would it be fair to say that Di Stefano's greatest moment was the 1960 European Cup final at Hampden Park in Glasgow when Real Madrid will beat Eintracht Frankfurt 7-3? I don't know how many, I think Di Stefano, did he score a hat-trick, or he certainly dominated the game?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few of those European Cup finals that are really worth a watch, but that is a very special one. I think famously the game that a young Alex Ferguson went to and made him fall in love with football as well. But yeah, I mean, that's probably the most dominant, maybe the most famous club performance, I think, in the history of the European Cup, maybe in the history of football in terms of club football. And Di Stefano was the ringleader. I think there's a time when him and Puskas are in the same team. And it is just fantastic to watch. Di Stefano, a player, could do almost everything. I mean, we talk about the false nine role, and you know the way Lionel Messi plays football has been quite innovative. But this was a player who could play striker, attacking midfielder, defensive midfielder in one. He was everything. He was more than just a number 9, more than a goal scorer. But yeah, he certainly scored goals as well.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I heard that you were a contributor, I didn't expect you to be writing about either Maradona or Di Stefano. You're best known for your book, Zonal Marking, The Making of Modern European Football. You're a stat man, and I would have thought that perhaps you would have written about Cruyff or Beckenbauer. Did you get a choice on who to write about, or did you just write whoever was given to you by, I think Oliver Kay is the editor of the whole thing?
A bit of both. I think the organisers went through the list, and if we'd ranked a player particularly highly, then we were kind of given those players, which didn't work out all the time. I was given Maradona at a slightly later date, so I think perhaps someone decided they were too busy to do it or something. I don't know. Maradona was thrust on me quite late on the day.
But, well, it's not a punishment, yeah. Is it?
No, although, you know, it was obviously the top 5, the top 10 have the entries are a lot longer than the others. So,
well, I hope they're paying you by the word, Michael.
I wish.
Coming back to the zonal marking, it's an excellent book about changes in tactics. If anyone asked me the greatest footballer in history, it would have been Cruyff, because of the tactical revolution that he seems to have engendered, plus the cultural and political dimension to Cruyff and his role in the invention of Dutch football. How would you analyze Cruyff in terms of the history of the game, in terms of his greatness, particularly in a tactical sense?
Yeah, I think there's a good argument that he was the most revolutionary, most influential player, or maybe most influential figure, because I don't think we should forget, of course, the fact he was a very successful manager as well, maybe not as successful as he was as a player.
And Barcelona, of course, he kind of made them in a way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you look at the list of the top 10 we've got, it's only Cruyff and Zidane who have had great success as a manager, and Beckenbauer as well, who've had great success as a manager. But yeah, Cruyff, I think, was an incredibly romantic figure, epitomized a completely new way of playing the game. I think even though there was a coach involved in Rinus Michels at Ajax and Barcelona and the Dutch national team, I think Cruyff was the leader from a pretty early stage. And it's a bit of a thing in Dutch football that they believe in player power. That's not a dirty word. They believe that the players are the ones with the talent and should have the power. And even though the team was run as a bit of a democracy, they had a clear leader in Cruyff. And again, a bit like Di Stefano, a little bit like Messi, he could do everything. He played often with, well, in his early days with number 9 on his back before he adopted the 14 as his thing. But he dropped everywhere. He dropped into midfield. He dropped into defence. He was a complete, total footballer. And yeah, epitomised one way of playing, I think, probably as much as anyone up until maybe Xavi with the Spanish Barcelona passing of, 30, 40 years later. And you can see the lineage.
You feature Xavi. You wrote about Xavi too in the book. Is there a political dimension here? I mentioned this with Amy. Johan Cruyff was unambiguously a man on the left. I once met him in a Amsterdam restaurant. He was delightfully accessible, remarkable man on many different levels. When you compare Cruyff, I mean, obviously, to somebody like Ronaldo, who earlier this month happened to visit a certain Donald Trump in the White House, should we include the political dimension of Cruyff, that he saw himself as a man of the people? And of course, he saw the game itself, which began as a working class sport, as in some ways, I guess, a political endeavor.
Yeah, I think it's always tough to separate the person from the player. I think particularly with Cruyff, and I think particularly because he was always very bold and very unashamed about the fact that the way that they played was, he thought, related to the Dutch culture and related to a lot of other concepts within the Netherlands at that time, indeed Amsterdam within that time. So yeah, I think it's tough to separate really the politics from the person. Again, maybe you could say that Messi is someone who we don't really know much about him. I don't think he's ever really spoken.
Well, there's not much to know about Messi. That's the fear, isn't it? That he's sort of managed by his family or by agents, and he's just from the age of about 4.5. He played football, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think you're right. But no, Cruyff was a very special figure, and I think again, him and Maradona probably go above and beyond everyone else in the top echelons of that list in terms of their personality.
I know you're an analyst as well. You often tweet about Opta analyst. Does data help in terms of analyzing greatness, as you say? I mean, if you ran Maradona through the data mixer, you might find that he didn't actually always perform. Is it helpful or is it a hindrance in our data-obsessed age, Michael?
I think it can be both. I mean, I think Maradona is a good example of where actually the stats from his World Cup performances do really jump out. He's the only person to have scored 5 goals and assisted 5 goals at a World Cup. I think in that World Cup 1986, he dribbled past 3 times as many players as anyone else. I think he was the most fouled player in three different World Cups. So I think you can use that to see his greatness. I think you can also use it to say that there were some seasons where he wasn't really at it, and that was probably a reflection of his lifestyle and his personality. But yeah, we can get too lost in the data. I think that's fair to say. And it's also important to point out that it can be very tough to compare data from one era to the next for several reasons. The expansion of the World Cup, or the quality of opposition, or the number of matches people were playing. I mean, Pelé scored an extraordinary number of goals because he played an extraordinary number of friendly games. So yeah, I think you have to be clever about how you use data. But I do think, I mean, Opta have got the data from every World Cup match going back to 1966, and it's actually quite fascinating sometimes to see that, you know, you can look at Pelé from 1970, and yeah, he was on a different level from everyone else, and the numbers reflect that.
Defenders don't tend to rank in these kinds of books or lists. Beckenbauer, I think, is the top-ranked defender. Should we take defenders a little more seriously? I mean, obviously Messi, Pelé, Maradona, even Cruyff are famous for their goals, their attacking play. But the great sides and the great achievements, aren't they usually made by defenders like Beckenbauer, of course, who defeated Cruyff very famously in the 1974 World Cup.
Yeah, and obviously Beckenbauer, I think, was famous for being a defender who was more than a defender. I think he was a creator as much as a defender, even if he did start in defence. I think the thing about defences is that it's more of a collective thing than attacking. Attacking has become increasingly collective throughout the years. You can trace that going back from the 1880s to the modern time. It's always become more planned, more collective, more about passing, more about integrated movement rather than just dribbling and scoring. The goal Maradona scored against England, for example, I don't think you see too much of that in the modern era. And defending does tend to be more of a collective thing. And I think probably more so than ever. I mean, back in the day when everything was about man marking, football kind of was 11 or 10, if you like, individual battles on the outfield, and then you try and beat the goalkeeper. Whereas today, I think the way that teams play, there's probably less outstanding defenders for various reasons, partly because it's collective and partly because I think defenders are asked to be elegant on the ball. They're asked to be playmakers, maybe not traditional defenders as they once were. But yeah, you're right. There's not a lot of defenders on there. I mean, Beckenbauer is very much the exception. I think you've got to go down to Paolo Maldini is actually 17, I think. But after that, you've got to go a fair way down to find maybe Baresi's in the top 20. But there's not many. You're right.
Bobby Moore's also in it, the English defender and captain who won the 1966 World Cup. You also wrote a book, The Mixer, the story of Premier League tactics from Route 1 to False 9. So you live in England. You're a keen observer of English football. Why are there so few truly great English footballers? I don't know who the top one is. It might be Moore, might be Stanley Matthews. I know Gascoigne's in maybe the top 50 or 60. Harry Kane, for one reason or other, doesn't seem to be in it. Maybe it's because so many of the contributors are Arsenal journalists. But why doesn't England figure, given it's supposed to be the birthplace of football, given it certainly has the dominant domestic league?
I think there's various reasons for that. I think one of the reasons that English football has traditionally been a little bit skeptical of mavericks. I think there's often been a desire to kind of amalgamate them into a system rather than bringing out the best in them. I mean, Bobby Charlton, I think, is number 20. Yeah, I think
Charlton. I forgot about Charlton.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously the classic example of a number 10 or an attacking midfielder who became England's leading all-time goal scorer. There's a few names up there, but you're right. There's probably not many real geniuses. I think in recent times, England's tended to excel at a slightly different type of player, which is probably more of a hard-working player, maybe talented, but I think about getting up and down the pitch. And English football tends to value those kind of qualities: the hard work, the scrappiness, the physicality, the determination, I think, as much as raw talent. But you're right. I mean, Kane's longevity, I think he's probably just a couple of big trophies away from being in the conversation now. Obviously, he's got a couple of Euros finals.
In the top. I don't quite know. Maybe the poll got made. Well, when was it made? A year or two ago. But he will eventually end up. And who's your favorite English player of all time that you've watched or read about?
That is a very good question. I mean, I think one of the most fabled English players who unfortunately missed out on being in the 11 in 1966 was Jimmy Greaves. I mean, if you watch league football in the 1960s, Jimmy Greaves was the man. His goal scoring record was absolutely incredible and was very unfortunate because of a combination of injury and Jeff Hurst, doing well when he came into the team, that he missed out on the side for the 1966 World Cup final. But I mean, he was a player who, you look at his goal scoring record and you think maybe he was just a number 9, but when you watch the videos, the way he dribbled through defences, I mean, he was, I think quite similar to a Cruyff or a Di Stefano.
I think he was actually closer to a Messi in the sense that, I mean, I'm lucky enough to see him when I was very young. Every time he got the ball, people stood up because he could just glide past people. And I think you note the injuries. Had he not had that bad injury, I think it was in 63 or 64, he might have, I mean, he certainly would have played in the 66 final, but he might be, I mean, what is he on the list? I think in the 50s, but he might be in the top even 10, I guess.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to the conversation about, what do we value? Do we value club football or international football? At the time, all the greats are basically judged on international football. And obviously he didn't quite make the 11 for that game. But if you look at his record in club football over 15 years, I mean, it's probably, you could argue it's better than anyone else in Europe at that time. Maybe the Real Madrid players aside, he was on an incredibly high level for an incredibly long period. And of course was a much loved personality as well, long after he retired from the game. So yeah, I think Greaves obviously before my time. I'm jealous you got to see him, but he's the one who, reading about him and watching the videos of him, I think he's one of those players who just seems on a different planet to the players he's playing against.
Yeah, and I think comparing him to Maradona is also helpful. His career was in some ways tragic, as you say, got left out of the 1966 team. He was sold without his knowledge to West Ham, I think, in 1970. He became an alcoholic. It's a dramatic game, isn't it, Michael? And the lows in some ways are as dramatic as the highs for characters like Greaves and Maradona. I don't know about Messi or even Pele, but the experience of being on the stage of world football and then falling for one reason or other must be very hard to take. Greaves struggled, Maradona struggled, many other players have struggled.
Yeah, I think that is true. I think there's a lot of players on near the top of that list you could say that about. I mean, Ronaldinho would be another one. I think at his peak, one of the great entertainers. I mean, at his best, he was not merely the best player in the world. He was completely unique in terms of the trickery that he would do, and someone who, you know, in the end probably had more longevity than people expected, but certainly his European peak was pretty short, and someone who's had his struggles away from the pitch as well. So yeah, George Best being another one. There's quite a lot of players in that.
Best is on it, and so is Law. I mean, there's Charlton, Best, Law, the Manchester United European Cup winner team. Although Law didn't play in the final, did he?
I think you're right, yeah. But yeah, there's so many of those stories, and I think some of those stories are featured in the book.
So why do you love the game so much, Oliver? Not Oliver, Michael. You've dedicated your life to it. I asked Amy. You're another Arsenal fan, unfortunately. What is it about this game that makes it so compelling that you spend your life, or at least your professional life, thinking and writing about and watching?
I think there's a few reasons. I think some of it is the beauty of the game itself. I think football's a sport that blends physical qualities and technical qualities, tactical qualities, psychological qualities. I think it's a real, almost all-round game in that sense. I think another factor, which I think is relevant for this book, is that it's such a global sport. I mean, the other team sports that are big in England or in Britain, cricket and rugby really are played by kind of 10 countries worldwide. Football is an incredibly global game. And I think when you go to matches, one of the great things is that it's pretty much the lowest scoring sport in the world. And when you have those moments, when you do have a goal, you might go to a game and not get a goal. But when you do have 1 or 2 goals a game, I think the exhilaration is almost, or it can be on a different level from anything else, because goals are so rare, so goals are so valuable. So there's a few reasons. But yeah, I think this book is a good example of how much the game has shifted over the years. It's played in a completely different way now from Pele's time or Di Stefano's time, and some people inevitably find it less enjoyable than when they were young. But yeah, I find it it's a very enduring sport. I think, much as we might complain it's not as good as when we were kids, it's more popular than ever. It still encapsulates so much of what people want from sport.
The book is out already, but I think it's designed to be a World Cup book for next year. Are you looking forward to the upcoming World Cup? It's been increasingly politicized by the head of FIFA and Donald Trump and the US involvement. Are you fearful that it might degenerate into a kind of political circus? Or might it be one of the great competitions?
I'd be surprised if it's one of the great competitions, to be honest, not necessarily for political reasons, but because I think the expansion of the competition means there's going to be an incredible number of games, some of which are not going to be particularly competitive. I mean, there are more games in the group stage of this tournament than in any World Cup previously, and that's just to get the field down from 48 to 32. And 32, of course, is the number we're used to in the World Cup. I'm also intrigued by the logistics of playing it over such a huge, massive land. I think that could cause some problems, maybe not for players who have...
It's Canada, Mexico, and the United States, right?
Yeah, which I think for players, will probably be fine. But I think for supporters, it could be very, very difficult. And of course, there's an incredible contrast to Qatar, where everywhere was within an hour's bus ride of the.
Well, that wasn't a
centre of
particularly great
Doha.
tournament either, so was it?
I kind of agree with you. People seem to talk about it as one of the great ones based upon the final, but no, I thought it was quite a slow burning one. Not that many memorable matches. But yeah, it's tough to work it out because we've never had a 48 team World Cup before, and there'll be a lot of teams there that people have. I mean, I've never seen Uzbekistan play a match. Maybe I should be more excited about seeing them play a match for the first time, but I think there'll be a few teams there who, with respect, just won't be able to compete.
What do you think are the great tournaments? Which World Cups? Which ones? I mean, whether you saw them yourself or you read about them.
I think that the obvious one that springs to mind is World Cup 1970. I think is the most fabled one. That the Brazil team who won it probably up there with the best teams ever. I think the more I read about 1958, it sounds like a great tournament to be at.
The one where Pele first appeared. Was that in? Was it in Sweden?
Up in Sweden, yeah. And I mean, when you read reports of the early World Cups, I mean, a combination of the poor organisation and, to be frank, the fact that a lot of teams were not entering them means that you've probably got to go to about 1958 before it really feels like a proper global tournament. So that's up there. And I think 1986, just in terms of moments and in terms of having one player in Maradona who dominated the tournament, I think it's got to be up there as well. I think the recent ones have been okay. I don't think there's been many terrible ones. I don't think there's been any truly great ones either. And I think the more you expand the tournament, the more you kind of water down the quality, and the more gamers there are that are probably less relevant, to be honest. So I think it's probably some of those, not the early ones, but the ones in the 70s and the 80s, I think probably stand out as being the best ones.
Finally, Michael, you mentioned the 1970 World Cup, which was the first World Cup I watched carefully. I was around in '66. I remember the final, not much else. I remember my father going to the quarterfinals against Argentina at Wembley. But the 1970 World Cup was the first one that was really shown on television. It's perhaps most famous for the fourth goal by Carlos Alberto, a fullback who isn't on the list. I think he should be on the list just for the goal. How would you compare the Carlos Alberto goal, which was the ultimate team goal? He was given the ball by Pele at the end of the game, versus Maradona's famous solo goal against England in the quarterfinals of the 1986 World Cup? Which is better? I mean, those are often, well, they're almost always, I think, ranked number 1 and 2. People have different opinions, which perhaps reflect their different interpretation of the game, whether it should be an individual game versus a team game. The Maradona goal being the ultimate individual goal, the Carlos Alberto goal being the ultimate team goal.
Yeah, I think it's a great way of framing it. And I think that is one of the beauties of football. It's a team sport, but of course, individual brilliance can have a massive impact. I mean, I think on a personal level, I'd probably go for the Brazil one. I like the cohesion of teams. I like it. You know, I think football ultimately is a team sport. And I think when you have that understanding between players, it elevates it to something completely different. And I think the great thing, or the fascinating thing about that Brazil team, is it was the right blend. We talk, you know, a lot of people these days will say there's not enough individual brilliance in football and that it's too much about systems. Well, that 1970 team wasn't really a system. I mean, they had 5 great attacking players who were on each other's wavelength, and there was no real attempt from Mario Zagallo, the coach, to formulate attacking moves or to talk about positions. You could argue there was almost 5 number 10s who basically worked things out for themselves. And I think that's the kind of great midpoint that the great teams get to. They have fantastic individuals who also are selfless, and they realize that the way to win is to work as a team. And that, the goal in isolation looks good, but I think when you watch the whole game, and that's almost the icing on the cake, it is fantastic because they've completely exhausted a very defensive Italy side with great passing football. And the last thing they do is just open up space. And Carlos Alberto, who was running on the overlap as he was the whole of that tournament, provides
the Pele pass is a thing of such simplicity and genius. I think it reflects both the simplicity and genius of the game itself, is that you don't need complexity to make it a brilliant game.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Pele always used to say some variation of, it's not about knowing how to shoot and how to pass. It's about knowing when to shoot and when to pass. And I think he was the epitome of that. And I think a lot of the great players on this list, they were kind of given freedom from the system, but they used that freedom for the good of the team. And I think Pele was a good example of that. I mean, on his day, he was just light years above everyone else on the pitch. But I don't think he played in a selfish way. I think he always played for the team.
Yeah, he's the reverse. One wonders whether Maradona or even Messi would have passed the ball at the end of that game. And of course, the great counterfactual of 1970 is, had Bobby Moore not been perhaps stitched up for theft, the English came closest to beating Brazil. I think they lost 1-0. So who knows? But wonderful conversation, Michael. Congratulations on the book. You came up with the team argument for the game. You're part of the team at The Athletic, which I think now is just about the best publication online about politics. The book is out, The Soccer 100, the story of the greatest players in history. Congratulations, Michael. And we will look forward to more analysis from you, particularly about the upcoming World Cup. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you for the conversation. Really enjoyed it.